The most dangerous man in Eldermere did not reject 10 noble brides because they were unworthy. He rejected them because not one of them could look into a room full of cruelty and remain kind. By 7 o'clock, Whitmore Hall had filled with candlelight, perfume, silk, and quiet ambition. Outside, the Atlantic wind struck the cliffs with enough force to rattle the tall black windows, and far below the house, the sea threw itself against the rocks as though trying to climb them. Inside, beneath a ceiling painted with fading angels, 10 young ladies stood in a perfect crescent across the marble floor. They had come with mothers, fathers, chaperones, jewels, family names, and fortunes written carefully into contracts waiting in leather cases. Each of them had been dressed to become a duchess. Each of them had been told the same thing before arriving: endure his silence, smile at his coldness, and do not fear the Duke of Whitmore no matter what stories were whispered about him. Clara Bennet had been told no such thing. She entered through the side door behind Lady Evelyn Hart, carrying a silver tray of folded gloves and smelling faintly of rainwater, wool, and lavender soap that had been used too many times. Her dress was plain grey, mended at the cuff with thread a shade too pale. Her hair, a soft brown, had been pinned low at the back of her neck, not to flatter her face but to keep it out of the way while she worked. No one announced her. No one looked at her except to make certain she was where a servant ought to be, near enough to obey, far enough to forget. Whitmore Hall seemed built for forgetting. Its stone walls rose cold and severe from the cliffside, its corridors long enough to swallow footsteps, its portraits darkened by age and smoke. The eastern wing had been closed for years, and the servants crossed themselves when passing its locked doors, though Clara had never been superstitious. She believed more in hunger, debt, winter, and the small humiliations by which the poor were taught to lower their eyes. At the top of the grand staircase, Duke Nathaniel Whitmore appeared without introduction. The murmurs died so quickly that the silence felt like a hand closing around the room. He was tall, dressed in black evening clothes without ornament, his dark hair touched faintly with silver at the temples. His face was not cruel, Clara thought before she could stop herself. It was worse than cruel. It was tired in a way that made kindness seem impossible. His grey eyes passed over the 10 brides one by one, measuring jewels, smiles, lowered lashes, rehearsed grace. The first young lady stepped forward with a curtsy polished by generations of instruction. Her mother whispered that her dowry included 2 townhouses and land in Virginia. The Duke said, "No." The second had a lineage older than the colonies. "No." The third played piano, spoke French, and had once been praised by a bishop for her charity. "No." By the 6th refusal, fans trembled. By the 8th, fathers began exchanging offended glances. By the 10th, Lady Evelyn Hart's smile had sharpened into something brittle and bright. Clara stood beside the nearest column, holding her tray so steadily that no one could see the ache in her fingers. A lace handkerchief slipped from Lady Evelyn's gloved hand and drifted to the floor directly in front of Clara's worn shoes. "Pick it up properly," Lady Evelyn murmured, her voice sweet enough to travel. "This is the closest you will ever stand to greatness." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the room. Clara bent down. Slowly. Quietly. Not because she accepted the insult, but because she had learned that dignity sometimes survived best when it did not ask permission to remain. As her fingers closed around the handkerchief, she felt the weight of the room pressing upon her back. Then the Duke stopped looking at the brides. For the first time that evening, Nathaniel Whitmore looked at her. Nathaniel Whitmore's gaze settled on Clara with such stillness that the laughter around her faded before anyone understood why. She remained bent beside the fallen handkerchief, one hand resting against the cold marble floor, the other holding the white lace as if it had become evidence in some silent trial. Lady Evelyn noticed the change first. Her smile faltered, then returned brighter and crueler, like a candle flaring before the wick collapses. "Clara," she said lightly, though her eyes had hardened, "do not keep His Grace waiting on account of your clumsiness." Clara rose at once. Her knees ached from the marble, but she did not touch them, did not smooth her dress too anxiously, did not reveal that every face in the hall had turned toward her. She offered the handkerchief back with both hands. Lady Evelyn took it between two fingers, as though accepting something spoiled, and tucked it into her sleeve. "Forgive her, Your Grace," Lady Hart called from beside the fireplace, her diamonds trembling at her throat. "The girl is useful enough below stairs, but she has never learned how to behave in proper company." A few guests smiled. One older gentleman gave a soft cough into his glove. Clara lowered her eyes, not in shame, but in calculation. She had survived the Hart household for 4 years by learning which insults required silence, and which required escape. This one required stillness. The Duke descended one step. Then another. The sound of his polished shoes against stone echoed through Whitmore Hall like the slow ticking of a clock. "What is her name?" he asked. Lady Hart blinked, as though the question were too strange to understand. "Her name, Your Grace?" "Yes." His voice was calm. "The girl you have just asked me to forgive." Lady Evelyn gave a small laugh. "Clara Bennet. She came to us from some schoolmaster's cottage near Briar Glen. My mother keeps her out of kindness." Kindness. The word moved through Clara like winter air through a cracked window. She thought of the small attic room at Hart House, the wages never paid in full because of old debts, the letters from her mother folded beneath her mattress, each one thinner and more careful than the last. She thought of her father's book sold by the crate, his inkstand taken by a creditor, his spectacles left on the mantel as if he might return to finish the lesson he had begun. Still, her face did not change. Nathaniel watched that most of all. Not the faded dress. Not the servant's apron removed in haste before entering the hall. Not the rough place on her thumb where needlework had marked the skin. He watched the discipline of a woman who had been given 100 chances to become bitter, and had refused each one in public. "Miss Bennet," he said. Clara looked up because he had addressed her as if she were a person and not an object misplaced in the room. The title struck more sharply than the insult had. "Yes, Your Grace." "Were you instructed to stand there?" "I was instructed to remain available, Your Grace." A murmur passed through the guests. The answer was proper. Too proper. Honest without being insolent. Lady Evelyn's cheeks warmed. "She means she was brought to assist me. Then why is she being used to entertain the room?" Silence fell again, but this time it was not the respectful silence offered to power. It was the frightened silence of people who had suddenly realized that power had chosen a different target. Lady Hart opened her fan. Closed it. Opened it again. "Surely Your Grace does not object to a harmless correction." Nathaniel reached the bottom of the staircase and stood beneath the chandelier, its light catching the hard line of his face. "I object to waste." Lady Hart's expression brightened with relief. "Exactly. That is what I have always said about servants who forget their place." "No," Nathaniel said. "I mean the waste of asking me to choose among 10 polished performances while the only honest soul in this room is made to stand behind a column." Clara felt the air leave her lungs. Lady Evelyn turned toward him fully now, pride wounded beyond concealment. "Your Grace cannot be serious." Nathaniel did not answer her. His gaze remained on Clara, and for one unbearable moment she wished he would look away. Being ignored had been painful. Being seen was terrifying. Outside, the wind struck the windows again, and the candle flames leaned as if bowing before something unseen. "Come here, Miss Bennet," the Duke said. Clara's fingers tightened around the edge of the silver tray. Every lesson poverty had taught her warned against stepping forward. Every instinct dignity had preserved told her not to retreat. So she crossed the marble floor, passing the 10 noble brides in their silk and pearls, hearing their skirts whisper like disapproval. When she stopped before him, Nathaniel looked not at her bowed head, but at her hands, steady despite the room's cruelty. "Tell me," he said quietly, "if you were free to leave this house tonight, would you go back with them?" Clara knew the Harts were listening. She knew one wrong word could cost her the roof over her mother's head. Yet beneath the fear, a small truth rose like a flame refusing to die. "No, Your Grace," she whispered. "I would not." Lady Hart made a sound so soft and sharp that it might have been a laugh, if laughter could cut. The girl is confused, Your Grace. She has been overwhelmed by the grandeur of the evening. Clara kept her eyes lowered, but the words reached her like cold fingers at the back of her neck. Confused. Overwhelmed. Words often used by those who wish to turn truth into weakness. Nathaniel Whitmore did not move. I asked Miss Bennet a question. She answered it. With respect, Lord Hart said, stepping forward at last, his face flushed above his stiff collar. There are matters of obligation involved. The girl is attached to our household by debt, and her mother receives shelter through our generosity. Surely your Grace understands that servants cannot simply be taken because they please the eye for a passing moment. The last words slid into the hall with practiced politeness, yet every person heard the insult beneath them. Clara's cheeks warmed, not from vanity, but from the old exhaustion of being discussed as property. She had known hunger. She had known grief. She had known the humiliation of counting pennies by candlelight, while her mother pretended not to cough in the next room. But nothing had prepared her for standing beneath a crystal chandelier while her life was weighed aloud by men who had never missed a meal. Nathaniel's gaze turned slowly to Lord Hart. Show me the papers. Lord Hart blinked. I beg your pardon? The documents binding her to your household. A faint stir moved through the room. Lady Evelyn's fan stopped midair. Lady Hart's hand tightened over her necklace. They are not here, Lord Hart said. Naturally, one does not bring household accounts to an evening of refinement. Then you should not have brought a debt into one. The Duke's voice remained quiet, but the room seemed to shrink around it. Clara felt something dangerous and impossible rise within her. Hope. She tried to push it down at once. Hope had ruined many poor girls. It made them mistake doors for exits when they were only painted onto walls. Yet Nathaniel had asked for papers. Not promises. Not rumors. Papers. Her father had taught her that ink was a second kind of blood in the world of gentlemen. It could condemn. It could protect. It could lie with a seal pressed neatly into wax. Lady Hart recovered first. Your Grace, perhaps this conversation would be better continued elsewhere. The girl has duties. Lady Evelyn has waited all evening for the honor of your consideration. Lady Evelyn received my consideration, Nathaniel said. She did not survive it. A gasp traveled through the brides like wind across tall grass. Lady Evelyn went pale, then crimson. Clara took one small step backward, instinctively wishing to disappear again, but the silver tray in her hands betrayed her with a faint tremble. Nathaniel noticed. His expression changed, not softening exactly, but becoming less distant, as though some locked chamber behind his eyes had briefly opened. Set that down, he said. Clara obeyed, placing the tray on a narrow table beside a marble urn. Without its weight, her hands felt strangely exposed. Miss Bennet, he continued, you said you would not return with them if you were free. Are you free? The truth stood before her like a cliff edge. She could retreat into safety, return to Hart House, and be punished quietly for having been noticed. Or she could step into the unknown offered by a man every county feared, inside a hall that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. She thought of her mother's thin letters. She thought of the locked cabinet at Hart House where Lord Hart kept documents she had once glimpsed by accident, her father's name written beside numbers that did not add correctly. She thought of Lady Evelyn's voice saying greatness as if it belonged only to those born close enough to touch it. Clara lifted her chin. Not high. Just enough to be heard. I do not know, Your Grace. The answer unsettled the room more than defiance would have. Nathaniel studied her. That is the first honest thing said in this hall tonight. Lady Hart's face hardened. This is absurd. She is a servant. No, Nathaniel said. Tonight she is a guest under my roof. Then he turned to the butler, who had stood silent near the great doors as still as an old portrait. Mrs. Vale will prepare the blue chamber in the west wing. Send a carriage to Briar Glen at first light to inquire after Mrs. Bennet. And have my solicitor at Whitmore Hall before breakfast. Clara's breath caught. The blue chamber. A guest room. A solicitor. Her mother. Each word landed like a bell struck in fog. Lord Hart took a step forward. You cannot mean to interfere in private family matters. Nathaniel looked at him with the cold patience of a judge who had already heard enough. You made them public when you humiliated her in my hall. For the first time, Lady Evelyn looked at Clara not as something beneath her, but as something suddenly beyond her reach. That frightened Clara more than the insult had. Envy was louder than contempt, and far less predictable. Nathaniel extended one gloved hand, not touching Clara, only offering the choice of direction. Come, Miss Bennet. The room waited for her to refuse, to apologize, to remember her place. Instead, Clara walked beside the Duke of Woodmore across the marble floor, past the 10 rejected brides and their stunned families, toward the shadowed corridor where candlelight thinned into gold. Behind her, whispers rose like smoke. Before her, the house opened into darkness. And for the first time in many years, Clara Bennet stepped into uncertainty without lowering her head. The corridor beyond the great hall was colder than Clara expected, as though Whitmore Hall kept its warmth only for guests, and allowed the rest of itself to remember winter. Candle sconces burned along the stone walls, their flames trembling in the draughts that slipped through hidden seams, and the sound of the gathering behind them faded until the noble voices became nothing more than a distant, wounded hum. Nathaniel Whitmore walked at her side without haste. He did not offer unnecessary comfort, and Clara was grateful for it. Comfort, when given too quickly, often felt like another form of pity. At the end of the passage, a narrow window looked out over the cliffs, where the moon had risen behind torn clouds and silvered the black Atlantic far below. Clara paused despite herself. She had never seen the sea from such a height. It seemed endless, merciless, alive with a darkness that breathed. "Does it frighten you?" the Duke asked. Clara realized he had stopped several feet away, giving her space as if space itself were a courtesy. "No, Your Grace," she answered after a moment. "It makes the house seem less lonely." Something crossed his face, too brief to name. "Most people say it makes the house seem haunted. Perhaps they are listening to the wrong thing." The words escaped before she could soften them. She lowered her eyes at once. "Forgive me. I spoke too freely." "You spoke accurately." He turned toward the stair that led upward. "The blue chamber is this way." They climbed 2 flights, passing portraits of pale women in dark gowns and stern men with hands resting on books, swords, or maps of land they had once claimed as if the earth had willingly belonged to them. Clara felt their painted eyes follow her plain gray dress and worn shoes. In another house, she would have entered such a room only to lay a fire or change linens. Here, the butler opened a carved oak door and stepped aside. The blue chamber was larger than the entire upper floor of the cottage where Clara had been born. A tall bed stood beneath a canopy of faded navy velvet. A fire had already been lit. Heavy curtains framed windows that faced the sea. There was a writing desk, a washstand, a wardrobe, and a small shelf of books whose leather spines glowed softly in the firelight. Clara stood at the threshold, unable to cross it. Mrs. Vale, the housekeeper, arrived with a ring of keys at her waist and an expression composed enough to conceal curiosity but not surprise. She was a silver-haired woman with careful hands and a face made stern by service rather than unkindness. "Miss Bennet," she said, not warmly, but properly, "I will have tea sent up. If you require anything else, you may ring." Clara looked from the housekeeper to the Duke. "Your Grace, I cannot accept this room." "Why not?" "Because rooms like this are not given without cost." The housekeeper went very still. Nathaniel studied Clara in the dim light. "And what cost do you imagine I would ask?" Clara swallowed. There were many answers the world had taught her to fear, but none belonged safely in this room, and none seemed to fit the man before her. His gaze was cold, yes, but not careless. His silence carried grief, not appetite. "I do not know," she said. "That is why I am afraid." Mrs. Vale looked down at the keys, as though suddenly interested in their shape. Nathaniel's voice lowered. "Then let us begin with certainty. You will lock your door if it eases your mind. No one enters without your permission. You will owe me no gratitude for shelter. You will not be asked to entertain my guests, flatter my pride, or repay insult with obedience. Tomorrow my solicitor will examine the Hart papers. Until then, you are safe under this roof. Safe. Clara had heard the word in sermons, in promises, in polite lies spoken over unpaid bills. Yet here, in this severe chamber above the Atlantic, it sounded almost unfamiliar enough to be true. Her fingers moved to the frayed cuff of her sleeve. And after tomorrow? After tomorrow, we will know which chains were made of law and which were made only of fear. He inclined his head, preparing to leave, but Clara found courage before he reached the door. Why did you choose me? The question entered the room softly, yet it seemed to touch every candle. Nathaniel turned back. For a moment, the Duke of Whitmore looked older than 38, not in years, but in sorrow. Because 10 women entered my hall prepared to become what others wanted, he said. You were the only one punished for remaining yourself. The door closed behind him with quiet finality. Clara stood alone in the blue chamber, listening to the fire settle and the sea strike the cliffs below. She crossed to the writing desk and touched the blank paper laid neatly beside the ink. For the first time in 4 years, no one had told her what she was allowed to write. By dawn, Whitmore Hall had changed its voice. The storm had passed some time before sunrise, leaving the windows silvered with salt mist and the cliffs washed clean beneath a pale American sky. Clara had not slept deeply. She had spent much of the night seated at the writing desk in the blue chamber, her borrowed shawl around her shoulders, staring at the blank paper until memories rose from it like ink from a well. At Hart House, paper had been rationed. Words had been watched. Letters to her mother had been read before they were sealed, and every sentence had learned to walk carefully. But here, no one came to take the candle away. No one knocked to ask why a servant needed light after midnight. When Mrs. Vale entered at 8 o'clock with breakfast, Clara had written only 4 words, "Dear Mother, I am safe." The housekeeper saw them, said nothing, and placed the tray near the fire. His Grace's solicitor arrived from the village before 7, she said. Lord and Lady Hart are in the library. Clara's hand tightened around the edge of the chair. Did they ask for me? Several times. Mrs. Vale poured tea with the calm precision of a woman who had survived many households by noticing everything and revealing little. His Grace refused. That should have comforted Clara. Instead, it made her heart beat harder. Protection was a strange room to enter after years of standing outside locked doors. She dressed in the same gray gown because she owned no other fit for daylight, though Mrs. Vale had brushed and pressed it until the fabric looked less defeated. When Clara was finally escorted downstairs, Whitmore Hall seemed quieter than the night before, but not gentler. Morning exposed what candlelight had concealed: cracks in the marble, faded places on the carpets, dust gathered high along portrait frames. It was a grand house, but grief had lived in it longer than guests had. The library doors stood open. Inside, Nathaniel Whitmore sat behind a broad mahogany desk, his solicitor, Mr. Alden Pierce, arranging papers beside him. Lord Hart stood near the fireplace, red-faced and rigid. Lady Hart sat upright in a chair, her smile polished so thin it looked painful. Lady Evelyn stood by the window, dressed in lavender silk, as if beauty might still win an argument that truth had begun to unravel. On the desk lay 3 documents Clara recognized at once. Her father's debt note. Her mother's housing agreement. The service contract that had kept Clara in the Hart household for 4 years. Seeing them there, outside Lord Hart's locked cabinet, made her feel as if part of her life had been stolen and returned damaged. Mr. Pierce looked up kindly. Miss Bennet, I must ask whether you can read these papers. Lady Hart gave a delicate laugh. She can read simple things, perhaps. Her father had ambitions beyond his station. Clara walked to the desk. The room watched her. She picked up the first document and felt the paper between her fingers. Good paper. Expensive paper. Too expensive for a struggling schoolmaster's agreement. Her father would have noticed that. Her father had noticed everything. Yes, Clara said. I can read them. Nathaniel's eyes rested on her face, steady and unreadable. Then read the amount aloud. Clara looked down. The number was written in a confident hand, $1,200. Her throat tightened. $1,200. Mr. Pierce slid another paper forward. And this copy, filed with the county office 3 years before your father's death? Clara read it twice because grief made the first reading blur. $400. The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded with guilt. Lord Hart shifted. Clerical errors occur. Not in 3 separate ledgers, Mr. Pierce replied. And not all in your favor. Clara stared at the figures until the room seemed to tilt. For years she had believed her father had left them ruined. For years she had carried shame that was never hers. Lady Evelyn spoke sharply, panic piercing her elegance. Even if there was some mistake, that does not make her suitable company for his grace. Nathaniel rose then, slowly enough that no one missed it. Suitability is often the mask society gives to theft when theft is well dressed. Lady Hart stood. Your Grace, you go too far. No, he said. I have only just begun. Clara looked at him and saw, beneath the coldness, something carefully restrained and deeply old. This was no passing act of mercy. This was recognition. Not only of her pain, but of a pattern he had seen before. On the desk, beneath the Hart papers, lay another folder sealed in black wax. Nathaniel touched it once, almost unconsciously, and Clara noticed the initials pressed into the seal, E.W. The late Duchess of Whitmore. The air in the library changed. The past had entered quietly, and every candle seemed to know its name. The black seal on Nathaniel Whitmore's folder held the room more firmly than any spoken accusation could have done. Clara did not know why the initials of the late Duchess should appear beside the Hart documents, yet she felt the connection before she understood it, as one feels thunder in the bones before the rain begins. Lady Hart saw it too. The color beneath her powder faded by a shade, and her hand moved toward the pearls at her throat, counting them unconsciously as if wealth could still protect her from memory. Lord Hart cleared his throat. Surely private papers concerning the late Duchess have no bearing on a servant's accounting dispute. Nathaniel's eyes lifted. You are very eager to decide what bears upon what. Mr. Pierce opened the black folder with careful hands. Inside lay letters, estate records, invitations, and a narrow ledger bound in dark green leather. Clara noticed the dates first. 8 years earlier. The year the Duchess of Whitmore had died. The year before Clara's father had lost his position at Briar Glen Academy and returned home with silence folded around him like a coat. Nathaniel touched one letter but did not read it aloud. For the first time since Clara had met him, his composure seemed not broken, but burdened. My wife, Eleanor, spent her final months investigating false charitable accounts tied to several noble families. Funds meant for widows, schools, and coastal poorhouses vanished before reaching them. She believed the fraud was hidden beneath respectable names. Lady Evelyn gave a brittle laugh. Charitable committees misplace money all the time. That is hardly a tragedy worthy of a Gothic tale. Clara looked at her then, really looked, and saw that Evelyn was not merely cruel. She was frightened. Nathaniel continued as though she had not spoken. Eleanor sent copies of her concerns to one honest schoolmaster because he had helped organize the Briar Glen Children's Fund. His name was Thomas Bennet. Clara's breath failed quietly. Her father's name, spoken in Whitmore Hall, seemed to bring him into the room, ink on his fingers, spectacles low on his nose, the warm patience of a man who believed truth could be taught if only people would sit still long enough to learn it. My father? She whispered. Mr. Pierce nodded. He refused to certify altered accounts. Soon after, a debt appeared against him. Then another. Then a complaint regarding his conduct as a teacher. None of the accusations were proven, but all were damaging enough to ruin him. Clara gripped the back of the nearest chair. Not for drama. For balance. Her father had not fallen from carelessness. He had been pushed by paper, by seals, by elegant lies no one poor could afford to contest. Lady Hart rose. This is offensive. You are weaving coincidence into scandal. Am I? Nathaniel asked. He drew one document from the folder and placed it beside the Hart service contract. The same notary. The same witness. The same alteration in the second line of figures. Lord Hart stared at the desk as if the wood itself had betrayed him. The silence stretched long enough for the fire to crack softly in the grate. Clara remembered a winter evening years ago, when her father had returned from the post office with no hat, though snow had gathered in his hair. He had sat at the kitchen table until dark, one hand covering a letter, the other resting on Clara's primer. When she asked what was wrong, he had smiled with unbearable gentleness and said, "Never mistake a fine signature for an honest hand." She had not understood then. She understood now. "Your Grace," Lady Hart said, voice thin, "even if certain clerks behaved improperly, my family cannot be held responsible for every mark on every page." Nathaniel looked toward the window, where morning light touched the Atlantic in cold strips of silver. "My wife believed the same network that ruined Mr. Bennet also silenced her investigation. After her death, I searched for proof and found only fragments. Invitations. Receipts. A list of names half burned in a study fireplace. Hart was on that list." Lady Evelyn stepped back from the window. "You invited us here because of that?" "I invited 10 families because each had a reason to fear what Eleanor had discovered." His gaze moved to Clara, and the hardness in it changed into something quieter. "I did not expect to find the daughter of the man who tried to help her standing behind one of them, carrying gloves like a shadow." Clara felt the room recede. The insult in the hall, the handkerchief, the laughter, even the blue chamber seemed suddenly part of a path neither she nor Nathaniel had chosen, yet both had been walking for years. Lady Hart's voice sharpened. "And what exactly do you intend to do with her? Make her a symbol? Parade her before society to satisfy your grief?" Clara flinched, because the question had lived secretly in her own heart since the night before. Nathaniel heard that flinch though she made no sound. He turned from Lady Hart and spoke to Clara alone. "No. I will use my name to uncover what was done. I will use my house to protect your mother. I will use every law available to free you from false debt. But I will not use you." The words entered her with a force gentler than kindness and stronger than pity. For one dangerous moment, Clara wanted to believe them completely. Mr. Pierce closed the green ledger. There will be a hearing before the county magistrate within the week. Until then, Miss Bennet should remain beyond the Hart's reach. "She remains here," Nathaniel said. Lady Evelyn's eyes flashed. "In what capacity?" The question struck the room like a thrown match. Clara stood very still. Nathaniel did not look away from her. "In the capacity she chooses." No one in that library liked the answer. Clara loved and feared it in equal measure. Because freedom, when first offered, did not feel like wings. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with the sea calling below, and no one left to blame if one stepped forward. By the third evening, Whitmore Hall no longer felt like a house that had accidentally opened its doors to Clara Bennet. It felt like a house holding its breath around her. Word had already traveled beyond the cliffs, carried by dismissed guests, offended mothers, and servants who knew how to make secrets move faster than carriages. In the village below, people were saying that the feared Duke had taken in a servant girl from the Hart household. Some called it charity. Some called it madness. A few, more dangerous than the rest, called it strategy. Clara heard none of it directly, but she felt its shape in the careful pauses of the staff and in the way Mrs. Vale watched the windows after sunset, as though expecting society itself to arrive with muddy boots and cold smiles. Nathaniel did not summon Clara that day. He sent books to the Blue Chamber instead: estate law, charitable ledgers, a volume of Emerson's essays, and her father's old primer, recovered from a storage trunk at Hart House by Mr. Pierce's clerk. Clara held the primer longest. Its cover was cracked. The corner of one page still bore a small ink flower she had drawn at 12 years old while pretending to listen to a lesson on fractions. At the sight of it, grief came without warning, not loud, not theatrical, but deep enough that she had to sit down before her knees forgot their duty. Near dusk, she carried the primer downstairs, following a thin line of lamplight toward the western gallery. She had meant only to return the book to the library, but the gallery doors stood open, and beyond them came the faint sound of piano notes, slow and uneven, as if someone were trying to remember a language almost lost. Clara stepped inside. The room was long, narrow, and lined with windows facing the sea. At its far end stood a grand piano beneath a sheet of gray cloth pulled halfway back. Nathaniel sat before it, one hand resting on the keys, the other closed around a small piece of ribbon the color of faded bluebells. He did not play when he saw her reflection in the dark glass. He did not hide the ribbon either. That restraint touched Clara more than concealment would have. "I did not mean to intrude," she said. "People rarely mean to," he answered, but there was no anger in it. Clara turned to leave. "Stay if you wish." The words stopped her more effectively than a command. She remained near the doorway, the primer held against her waist. Nathaniel looked at the book. "Your father's?" "Yes. I thought it had been sold. Most things are not lost as thoroughly as those who profit from losing them would like us to believe." He looked back at the keys. "Eleanor used to play in this room every morning. After she died, I ordered the piano covered. It seemed indecent for music to continue when she could not." Clara walked a few steps closer, not enough to crowd his grief. "And now? Now I wonder whether silence was loyalty, or only fear wearing mourning clothes." The sea moved beyond the glass, black and restless beneath the rising moon. Clara thought of her father's empty chair, of her mother folding away his shirts, of the years she had spent mistaking endurance for devotion. "My mother stopped baking bread after my father died," she said quietly. "He loved the smell of it. For months the house felt colder without it, but she said making it would hurt too much. One day I made a loaf badly, burned at the top and raw in the center. She cried for an hour, then ate 2 slices. Nathaniel looked at her, and something like the shadow of a smile touched his mouth before vanishing. "Was it truly that terrible?" "Worse, Your Grace." "Nathaniel," he said. Clara went still. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the windows. "Only when we are alone," he added, as if giving the boundary before the world could corrupt it. Clara should have refused. She knew that. Names were dangerous. They shortened distances that society had built tall for a reason. Yet his name rested in the room, not as a demand, but as a trust. "Nathaniel," she repeated barely above a whisper. The sound changed him. Not visibly enough for anyone else to notice, but Clara saw the breath he did not take, the slight lowering of his guarded eyes. He touched the piano keys again and played 3 notes, simple and aching. "Eleanor believed truth had a cost," he said. "I believed grief was the payment. I was wrong. The cost was letting fear decide what remained of me." Clara set the primer on the edge of the piano. "Then perhaps you have not finished paying." He looked at her for a long moment. "And you, Clara Bennett? What has fear decided for you?" She thought of the Hart papers, the county hearing, her mother's uncertain future, the gossip already sharpening beyond the cliffs. Then she thought of the hall where she had walked without lowering her head. "Less than it did before," she said. For the first time, Nathaniel played a full chord. It filled the western gallery, low and trembling, not joyful, not yet, but alive. Clara stood beside the piano as the sound faded into the walls, and Whitmore Hall seemed, for one brief breath, less like a tomb than a house remembering it had once been built for the living. The morning of the county hearing arrived under a sky the color of tarnished silver, and by 10 o'clock every carriage road leading to Whitmore Hall had filled with wheels, horses, whispers, and expectation. Nathaniel had refused to hold the matter in the village courthouse, where curious townspeople might press against the doors and turn Clara's life into entertainment. Instead, the magistrate agreed to examine the evidence in the great hall, the same room where Clara had once bent to retrieve Lady Evelyn's handkerchief beneath a circle of laughter. Now the marble floor had been cleared. A long table stood beneath the chandelier. The magistrate sat at its center with Mr. Pierce to his right, stacks of documents arranged with merciless neatness. Lord and Lady Hart had returned dressed in mourning colors they had not earned, their faces composed for sympathy. Lady Evelyn wore pale blue and looked at no one, which told Clara more than any confession could have done. The 10 families who had attended the bride selection sat along the walls, invited by Nathaniel not for spectacle, but for witness. Society had helped create the wound. Society would watch it close. Clara stood near the staircase in a dark green gown Mrs. Vale had altered from one of Eleanor Whitmore's old walking dresses. She had protested at first, but Mrs. Vale had only said, "The late Duchess would have preferred truth to dust." The gown was simple, high at the throat, modest at the wrists, and made Clara feel neither disguised nor displayed. Nathaniel stood several feet away, close enough to support her, far enough to let the room see she was not being carried by his power. That distance, chosen with care, steadied her more than any touch could have done. The magistrate began with the debt notes. Mr. Pierce presented the filed copy showing $400, then the altered copy used by the Harts, showing $1,200. He showed the service contract, the housing agreement, the suspicious fees added each winter, each one small enough to appear reasonable alone, cruel enough to become a cage together. Lord Hart called them errors. Lady Hart called them misunderstandings. Mr. Pierce called a clerk from the county office, who identified the same witness signature appearing on documents years apart, though the man had been dead before the later papers were supposedly signed. A murmur passed through the hall, low and dark. Clara felt no triumph. Only a strange grief. Proof did not restore lost years. It merely opened the locked room where they had been hidden. Then came the green ledger. The one tied to the charitable accounts Eleanor had investigated and Thomas Bennet had refused to approve. Mr. Pierce read from it carefully, naming funds intended for widows along the coast, for a schoolhouse in Briar Glen, for families whose fishing boats had been destroyed in storms. The money had passed through committees bearing noble names, then vanished behind false repairs, false salaries, false receipts. Hart appeared more than once. So did 3 other families seated along the wall. Faces changed. Fans lowered. The room, once proud of its silence, became afraid of it. Lady Hart rose abruptly. "These are old matters. Unpleasant, perhaps, but old. What purpose is served by dragging a dead schoolmaster and a dead duchess into this room?" Clara heard the words dead schoolmaster and felt something inside her, long trained to endure, finally stand upright. Before Nathaniel could speak, before Mr. Pierce could object, Clara stepped forward. Her heart beat so hard she could feel it in her throat, but her voice, when it came, was clear. "The purpose is that the dead cannot answer when their names are used as cover for the living." The hall stilled. Lady Hart turned on her with a smile sharpened by fear. "My dear girl, you have been coached." Clara looked at the woman who had kept her wages, read her letters, and called it kindness. "No, Lady Hart. I have been quiet. That is not the same as being empty." A sound moved through the witnesses, not quite approval, not yet, but attention. Clara continued, holding her father's primer against her side like a small shield from another life. "My father taught children to read accounts because he believed numbers could protect the poor from elegant lies. He noticed that the Briar Glen School Fund was being drained. He sent his concerns to the Duchess of Whitmore. After that, his debts grew, his reputation fell, and my mother and I were made grateful for the very hand that closed around us." Lady Evelyn whispered, "Stop. It was not command this time. It was pleading." Clara turned to her. "You knew the debt was false." Evelyn's eyes filled, though no tear fell. "I knew enough to be ashamed." That was the first crack. Then came the second. Lady Evelyn reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded letter, yellowed at the edges. Her hand shook as she placed it before the magistrate. My mother kept this hidden. It is from Mr. Bennet to the Duchess. I found it after the first night at Whitmore Hall. Lady Hart went white. Lord Hart sat down as though his knees had forgotten their purpose. The magistrate opened the letter, read the first lines, and his expression hardened. Nathaniel did not move, but Clara saw his grief pass through him like a shadow crossing candlelight. Eleanor had not imagined the pattern. Thomas Bennet had not failed his family. Clara had not been forgotten by fate. She had been buried by design. Outside, the sea struck the cliffs in one deep, thunderous breath, and inside Whitmore Hall, the room finally understood that the girl once ordered to kneel had become the one person still standing in the truth. The magistrate's decision came not like thunder, but like the closing of a heavy door. The altered debts were declared void. Clara Bennet's service contract was dismissed as fraudulent. Her mother's cottage in Briar Glen was restored without claim from the Hart estate, and the charitable accounts connected to Lady Hart's circle were ordered into full examination by county authorities. No one applauded. Truth, when it finally entered a room, did not require applause. It required witnesses. Lady Hart sat very still, her pearls shining at her throat like small pale moons above a ruined tide. Lord Hart stared at the table, unable to meet the eyes of the families who had once considered him respectable. Lady Evelyn wept quietly into her gloves, not loudly enough to seek pity, but honestly enough that Clara did not hate her. Shame had found many people in Whitmore Hall that morning, and for once it had chosen the correct seats. When the magistrate rose, the witnesses stood with him. Chairs scraped softly over marble. Papers were gathered. Doors opened to the grey afternoon. One by one, the noble guests passed Clara with lowered eyes. Some offered apologies too small for the years they had helped make possible. Others said nothing, which was wiser. Clara accepted neither too eagerly. Forgiveness, her father had once told her, was not a coin owed to anyone who suddenly feared the price of being remembered. Nathaniel remained near the long table, his hand resting on the black folder that held Eleanor's name. For hours he had spoken only when necessary, allowing evidence to do what anger could not. Now, as the hall emptied, he looked less like a feared duke than a man who had carried a locked coffin inside his chest and finally set it down. Clara approached him slowly. "Your wife was right," she said. Nathaniel's fingers tightened once around the folder. "So was your father." Between them lay the strange inheritance of two good people who had tried to tell the truth and paid for it in silence. Clara looked toward the marble floor where she had knelt days before. The place seemed unchanged, yet she knew it would never be the same. "I thought being cleared would feel like joy," she admitted. "It feels larger than joy. Heavier. Freedom often does at first." He turned toward her fully. "It asks what we will become when pain is no longer the only shape we know." Clara met his eyes then. The room was nearly empty, but the ghosts of its witnesses remained in the candle smoke, in the folded chairs, in the sunlight dimming beyond the tall windows. "And what will you become, Your Grace?" The formal title returned between them like a veil. Nathaniel heard it, and accepted the distance it gave her. "A better guardian of what remains, if I am able." He paused. "And perhaps, one day, a man not ruled entirely by what was taken from him." Mrs. Vale entered quietly to announce that a carriage had arrived from Briar Glen. Clara's mother was waiting in the morning parlor, pale from travel, wrapped in blankets, but alive, safe, and already asking whether her daughter had eaten. Clara's composure broke only then. Not into spectacle. Not into collapse. Just a breath caught too sharply, a hand pressed to her mouth, and eyes bright with the kind of relief that hurt because it had been delayed too long. Nathaniel stepped aside at once. "Go to her." Clara did. She ran no farther than dignity allowed, but faster than fear could follow. In the parlor, her mother rose with difficulty, and Clara crossed the last few feet into her arms. No grand speech passed between them. Only names. Only trembling hands. Only the holy silence of two people returned to one another after the world had tried to make them small. That evening, After her mother had been settled in the Blue Chamber and Mrs. Vale had personally ordered broth, tea, and fresh bread, Clara found Nathaniel in the western gallery. The piano stood uncovered. The faded blue ribbon lay beside the keys, but the black mourning cloth had been folded away. Outside, the Atlantic burned with the last copper light of sunset. Nathaniel did not turn when she entered. "I sent word to have the eastern wing opened tomorrow," he said. "Eleanor believed houses should not keep rooms for sorrow alone." Clara walked to the piano and placed her father's primer beside the ribbon. "My father believed books were doors." Nathaniel looked at the two objects resting together, and something in his face softened with such quiet pain that Clara had to look at the sea to steady herself. "What will you do now?" he asked. It was the question he had promised her from the beginning. Not a command. Not an arrangement made above her head. A choice. Clara listened to the wind, the house, her own heart learning the unfamiliar rhythm of being free. "First, I will take my mother home," she said. "Then I will reopen my father's school in Briar Glen, if the funds can be restored. They will be. And after that—" She stopped. Nathaniel waited, as he always did when the truth required courage. Clara turned back to him. "After that, I would like to return sometimes. Not as a servant. Not as a symbol. As myself." For a moment, the feared Duke of Whitmore looked as though the answer had undone him more than any vow could have done. Slowly, he bowed his head, not to a bride chosen before society, but to a woman who had chosen her own standing. "Then Whitmore Hall will be honored by your return, Clara Bennet." Months later, people would say many things about what had happened on the cliffs of Eldermere. They would speak of exposed fraud, restored funds, a fallen family, a reopened school, and the Duke who no longer refused every invitation sent to his door. But those who knew the truth understood that the real miracle had been quieter. A forgotten girl had not been rescued into greatness. She had revealed that greatness had been living in her all along. Some hearts do not need to be claimed by power, they need only one honest witness to remember how to rise.